Picture this. It is the winter of 1603. You step into shadowed halls of Richmond Palace. Its great corridors once alive with music and laughter now echoing only with the wind off the Thames. The air is damp, the stone walls cold to the touch. Incense lingers faintly, but its sweetness barely veils a heavier scent of age, mildew, and decline. At the heart of the palace sits a woman who once commanded an empire. Elizabeth Tudor, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the monarch who defied the Pope, defeated the Spanish Armada, and reigned in splendor for more than 4 decades. Once radiant in pearl-studded gowns and painted portraits, she is now hunched beneath layers of heavy robes, her frame frail and restless. Candlelight flickers across her face, catching the cracks in paint and powder where white lead once promised eternal youth. To her people, she was an icon of majesty. But here, in the final months of her reign, she is haunted not by triumphs, but by silence. The laughter of her court has given way to whisper conspiracies. The friends and advisers who had guided her for decades are dead. The one man she cherished most in her autumn years, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, died on the scaffold by her own command. Guilt presses down like a shroud. Elizabeth no longer speaks of the future. She avoids naming a successor. She paces endlessly through chambers at night, refusing to comfort sleep, as if closing her eyes would mean surrender. Courtiers tiptoe through dim corridors, exchanging glances but never daring to voice the obvious. Their queen is nearing the end. The once bright star of the Tudor dynasty stands at the threshold of darkness, her power still absolute on parchment, but in reality, slipping through her grasp. Around her, servants keep the fires lit. Musicians play softly in distant rooms, but nothing breaks the weight of isolation. And this is the truth of Elizabeth's last days. Not the golden ending of Gloriana, adored and eternal, but the shadowed decline of a woman surrounded by secrets, fear, and loneliness. What happened in her final months was more than a queen's fading health. It was the unraveling of an image, the collapse of myth, and the creation of a darker legacy her court long tried to conceal. Before we step any further into the shadowed world of Elizabeth's fading court, let me pause for just a moment. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden corners of history, the whispered truths, the overlooked details, the secrets left behind in palace walls, don't forget to subscribe and tap the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss our next journey into the mysteries that history books prefer to leave in the dark. For most of her reign, Elizabeth I was more than a monarch. She was a symbol. Courtiers praised her as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, radiant, untouchable, England's living embodiment of divine favor. Poets compared her to goddesses. Painters immortalized her ageless, with pearl-white skin and halos of jewels. And for her subjects, she seemed almost eternal, a ruler who had stood against Spain, outfoxed rivals, and guided England to more than 4 decades of triumph. But by the dawn of the 17th century, the mask was slipping. Elizabeth was in her late 60s, ancient by the standards of her day. Her once fiery red hair was thin and brittle, hidden beneath heavy wigs. Her famous complexion, once crafted with poisonous white lead, had turned cracked and hollow. The queen who once danced and dazzled now moved stiffly. Leaning on cushions, her body racked with restlessness. She still commanded her court with sharp wit and imperious gaze, but behind palace walls, a different picture emerged. She was plagued by the deaths of her most trusted advisers. She was haunted by guilt over her enemies' punishments. And increasingly, her nights were filled not with laughter, but with long, sleepless pacing through her chambers, as if afraid to rest. To her people, the great facade of Gloriana persisted in proclamations and ceremonies. But to her courtiers, whispers began to spread. Their queen was unraveling. The image of immortal majesty was cracking. Behind the carefully painted face was an elderly woman, frail and weary, resisting the march of time with cosmetic silence and sheer willpower. And here lay the danger. Elizabeth's reign had always depended on performance, the illusion that she was untouchable, unmatched, eternal. If that illusion faltered, the stability of the crown itself hung in the balance. The Virgin Queen was still alive in legend, but in reality, she was surrounded by fear, haunted by loss, and showing her court the one thing they were never supposed to see. her humanity. For decades, Elizabeth I had balanced her loneliness with a circle of brilliant minds and loyal hearts. Men like William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, her tireless chief minister, and Sir Francis Walsingham, the spy master who kept daggers from her back. They had been her anchors through storms of rebellion, war, and intrigue. With them, she ruled not as a solitary woman, but as the head of a vast, loyal machine. But by the end of the 1590s, those anchors were gone. Walsingham died in 1590, leaving her blind to plots she once outwitted so easily. Burleigh followed in 1598, taking with him not only decades of counsel, but bond of trust Elizabeth never replaced. One by one, the faces she leaned upon slipped into death. The queen who once stood at the heart of Europe's politics began to stand alone. And then came the blow that struck deepest, the betrayal of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. In her twilight years, Elizabeth had favored Essex above many in her court. Young, ambitious, and dazzlingly charismatic, he seemed to embody the energy she once possessed. She gave him commands, honors, and opportunities. She forgave his arrogance when others begged her to banish him. He wasn't just a courtier. He was her hope, a reminder that even in her old age, she could inspire fierce loyalty and love. But Essex's ambition reached too far. In 1601, frustrated by failures in Ireland and his waning influence at court, he raised an armed rebellion in London, a desperate gamble to seize power. The uprising collapsed within hours, and Essex was dragged to the scaffold. Elizabeth signed his death warrant herself. A queen could do nothing less. But as the axe fell, so did something within her. He wasn't just another traitor. He was her greatest wound. After Essex's execution, Elizabeth's grief worsened. Courtiers described her as withdrawn, consumed by guilt and bitterness. She dwelled on his memory, speaking of him in sorrowful tones. The virgin queen who had outlasted kings and popes was undone not by armies, but by loss. Loss of counselors, loss of love, loss of trust. She retreated inward, cold even to those who remained by her side. Where once her chamber buzzed with music and wit, now silence pressed heavier. Even her trademark sharp tongue softened into melancholy. Elizabeth had ruled for half a century with resilience and calculation, but in those last years, the weight of grief stripped her armor away. Alone in her palace, she carried the ghosts of her dead advisors and the specter of Essex's betrayal, and that burden, more than any foreign threat, shadowed her final days. By the final years of her reign, Elizabeth Tudor no longer looked like the vibrant queen who once danced at court or sparred with ambassadors. Her body betrayed her, but she struggled desperately to control the image. Eyewitnesses wrote of her restlessness. She would wander the palace corridors at night, pacing endlessly, a woman haunted by griefs she could not put to rest. She refused to unclothe or lay down to sleep, instead collapsing in exhaustion against cushions on the floor, muttering prayers or staring silently into the shadows. Sleep, once a nightly surrender, seemed to her like a rehearsal for death, and Elizabeth, ever defiant, would not give herself to it. Courtiers whispered that the queen would sometimes stand for hours, motionless, propped upright against cushions or attendants' arms, rather than be seen reclining like an invalid. To admit weakness was unbearable. To lie down was to acknowledge she was mortal. And Elizabeth had spent 50 years convincing the world she was more than mortal. Doctors were summoned, but she rejected their remedies. She refused potions and cordials, believing them useless. Or worse, an admission that she was no longer sovereign over her own body. Better to endure pain than to let others dictate her healing. Better to suffer in silence than to reveal vulnerability. And always there was the paint. The face that once glowed in portraits was now cracked and hollow, but Elizabeth insisted on her thick layers of white lead and rouge. Courtiers saw the strange effect. A mask atop a mask, fine lines filled with powder, hollows brightened with vermilion. From a distance, she still looked eternal. Up close, she looked like a fading fresco barely holding together. She wasn't just holding on to power. She was clinging to an image, her own eternity drawn in white lead and rouge. Yet beneath the mask, her attendants watched her falter. Her hands trembled. Her body shrank within her heavy gowns. And the radiant Gloriana of her youth, who once dazzled Europe, now became a spectral presence in her own court, half woman, half illusion. The great queen who had outlasted every enemy was at war with the one adversary she could not defeat, time. So she fought it not with armies, but with rituals, with paint, with pacing, with restless wakefulness. Her life became theater. Her body became her stage. And by the end, even her courtiers admitted. The Queen of England, who once refused to give herself to any man, now refused to give herself to human frailty. She defied it in every waking hour, until nothing remained but the struggle itself. As Elizabeth's body weakened, the walls of her court grew darker. Richmond Palace, once filled with spectacle and ceremony, began to resemble a stage where every glance carried hidden meaning. Courtiers moved softly, speaking carefully, measuring each word, because by the winter of 1603 one fact weighed on every mind. The queen was dying, and with her, an entire dynasty would end. Elizabeth was the last Tudor. For 44 years she had refused to name a successor, clinging to the belief that to do so would invite her own death. Her silence had strengthened her in her middle years. As long as the heir was unknown, no court faction could rally behind someone else. But in her twilight, that same silence bred something more corrosive, fear. Everyone knew who the likely candidate was. James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and great-grandson of Henry VII. He was the heir by blood and certainly by design of foreign ambassadors and ambitious courtiers. Yet in Elizabeth's presence, no one dared to say his name. To speak of succession while the queen still breathed could be judged treason, and treason beneath Elizabeth carried only one conclusion: the block, the axe, the fall of another head. So the silence of their queen infected her court. It was a silence filled with whispers, coded glances, half-muttered words erased by coughs. Ministers who had once debated policy now traded secrets like smugglers, never written, never spoken aloud in full. Loyalties shifted as quickly as the candlelight. Some still clung to Elizabeth, desperate to squeeze a final drop of favor from a fading monarch. Others quietly courted Scottish envoys, preparing for the inevitable dawn after Elizabeth's death. The tension was unbearable. An offhand comment could be fatal. A careless slip of the tongue could be construed as plotting. Men who had served Elizabeth for decades now avoided each other's eyes, wondering who would prove the first to bend to a new king across the border. The queen had not declared an heir, so every nobleman lived with suspicion of rivals, of friends, even of their own shadows. Elizabeth herself worsened the strain. She refused to acknowledge immortality, flatly rejecting any call to name James. Her courtiers pleaded for clarity, but she remained defiant, convinced that to concede the future was to surrender the present. Better to let her court choke under the weight of silence than to admit she was finished. And in that choking silence, paranoia thrived. By 1603, the Virgin Queen had turned her court into something resembling a hunted theater troupe. Every actor afraid of being caught rehearsing for the wrong play. The stage glimmered with jewels and ceremony, but underneath it was terror. A queen in decline, a dynasty nearing its end, and a court living in quiet fear which whispered would be the last they dared to speak. By March of 1603, Elizabeth Tudor had withdrawn fully into the shadows of Richmond Palace. Perched on the banks of the Thames, the old riverside residence was beautiful in its way. But in those final weeks, it whispered more of endings than beginnings. The damp air carried a chill that clung to its stones. The bells beyond its walls rang softer, muffled by fog, as if the very world had hushed itself in preparation. Inside, the palace fell silent. Courtiers moved on tiptoe, voices lowered into whispers. Fires were stoked constantly, yet the corridors felt cold. Servants brought trays of remedies, cordials, and healing broths, but Elizabeth turned them away. Her health was failing. Modern scholars guess bronchitis, perhaps pneumonia, maybe a general collapse brought on by exhaustion and age. But Elizabeth responded to illness as she had responded to every enemy in her life. By resisting, to accept medicine, she believed, was to surrender. To slip into bed was to admit that her reign was over. And so she refused both. Instead of reclining, she stood, or when her strength failed, she crouched, wrapped in heavy robes. For hours she sat on the floor, leaning against piles of cushions, eyes fixed on the shadows that gathered in the firelight. Attendants watched this eerie vigil with awe and fear. Some whispered she saw a ghost. Others believed she was lost in silent prayers. Her voice weakened, her eyes hollowed, but the crown still clung to her head. Witnesses reported that even as her body shrank and her cheeks hollowed, Elizabeth remained regal in gesture. She waved off courtiers with the imperious flick of her hand. She bore her crown in silence, refusing to let anyone see her lie down in defeat. She would never yield to husband, pope, or foreign king would not yield now to the indignities of her own flesh. But her decline continued. On the 23rd of March, she could no longer speak more than a whisper. By the 24th, the courtiers surrounding her chamber knew the inevitable had arrived. Bishops knelt in prayer. Nobles lingered outside, hardly daring to breathe. And so, in the dawn shadows of Richmond Palace, Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen Gloriana, the last of the Tudors, passed away. Yet even in her death, the myth endured. For though her body failed, she never formally surrendered. She died as she had lived, refusing to name an heir, refusing to admit defeat, locked in a battle of willpower to the very end. The woman who once declared she had the heart and stomach of a king left the world with a final defiance. Frail, silent, and broken in body, but unyielding in spirit, the woman who once lit England's golden age ended her reign in silence at Richmond Palace. This was Elizabeth I, a queen who had been painted as radiant Gloriana, immortal in pearls, timeless in strength. Yet her last weeks were not white halls of triumph, but dim corridors lined with fear, suspicion, and grief. Elizabeth was a monarch who danced beneath the glow of the Armada's defeat, who commanded poets to shape her name into legend, and who stood before her troops at Tilbury, declaring she had the heart of a king. To her people, she was majesty made flesh, the Virgin Queen, untouchable, chosen by God. But in her decline, the veil slipped. The reality was not golden radiance, but fragile flesh. She wandered sleepless at night, leaned against cushions instead of lying in bed, painted her weary face with thick white, led in defiance of time itself. To her courtiers, she was no longer an eternal sun, but a fading ember. She wasn't just Gloriana, goddess and symbol. She was also Elizabeth Tudor, frail, grief-stricken, old. The queen's myth and the queen's humanity wrestle with one another until the end. One adorned in portraits, the other staring into firelight from the floor of Richmond Palace. And here lies the paradox that makes her unforgettable. Did Elizabeth's greatness lie only in her prime, in the brilliance of her victories, the dazzle of her court, the fearless defiance of a young queen? Or was her greatness also in those final days, when she refused to surrender even as her body betrayed her, in her refusal to name a successor, in her restless pacing through night, in her sheer will to remain a sovereign presence even when frail and silent? The answer may never be clear. Perhaps her greatness was both, the victories and the decline, the majesty and the frailty, the goddess and the woman. But one thing is certain. Elizabeth's last days remind us that beneath every crown is a mortal body, and behind every myth stands a human soul, locked in defiance, refusing to fade quietly into history. Elizabeth's last days have often been cast as a tragic coda to a glittering reign. The long nights of pacing, the whispered court, the unpainted cracks behind the mask of Gloriana. Yet to dwell only on their darkness is to miss their meaning. Her decline did not diminish her. It humanized her. For half a century, she was a goddess dressed in cloth of gold, untouchable, radiant, and eternal. But behind the iconic portraits was a human being, frail, restless, and haunted by grief. The woman who had commanded empires now sat silent on the floor of Richmond Palace. The Virgin Queen, who once defied kings and popes, ended her life not untouchable in triumph, but profoundly human in sorrow. And yet, even in those shadows, Elizabeth was defiant. She refused to be seen lying down like an invalid. She refused medicine, refused a successor, and refused to surrender the image she had lived on for decades. Haunting, fragile, and stubborn, she clung to her crown until her last breath. This is the paradox of Elizabeth I. She was myth and mortality, goddess and woman, eternal Gloriana and age queen. Her strength was not only in her victories, but in her refusal to yield, even when the world, her body, and time itself demanded it. Elizabeth wasn't just a queen of a golden age. She was a queen who, even in her darkest days, turned decline into legend. The whispers of her isolated court remind us that history's icons are never only myth. They are human, and that is why they endure.